super excited because I invested in something I don't normally invest in for myself. And that is getting a swimsuit that I actually like. I know that sounds like such a simple thing. And I guess like I should explain this is like the problem with it is for me to have a swimsuit that I actually like, and I'm throwing that in heavy quotes for Tim here, is that they didn't exist. Right? I was that awkward person that wore like men's swim trunks not suited for me with this weird mesh stuff going up my junk and like trying to find like the lightest tank top I could. And then like I remember I was excited when tankinis became a thing. But even then, like that wasn't really like what I wanted in a sense. And so what was really funny is in my life as we've learned upon things, especially with the internet, making us so we can be more sophisticated without actually having to travel. You might recall, Tim, that at some point we learned about burqas. Like we got very aware about burqas in our history at one point. And my brain back in the day, this was years ago, went, huh, well, if they cover all the time, what do they swim in? And so I've known for several years now that there is a thing in existence that is actually the thing that I've wanted. And it's called a burkini. And so it is, and it's coverage. And like, by the way, my thing is like, I'm not necessarily ashamed to show skin. It's not that. First of all, my comfort is me, right? Me not wanting to show my skin is a reflection on my shit. But like for me, it was always the sun protection because I burn so easily and I hate sunscreen. Like, so for me, it's really mostly been, about modesty too, but also about like covering my white doughy cave flesh. That's not really meant to be out in the sun for more than like 10 minutes because I'm super white. Like I'm very, very, you guys see like the Reverend Tracy picture with that. Like, yeah, that's not all washout because of my robes. I am kind of pale complected.
Yeah,
And so,
when we record, I have to put on like eclipse glasses to watch her, folks.
I mean, I'm not that bad anymore because my toddler, my young boy, who constantly wants to be outside now, like has changed my color. Like I've got my watch off to charge, and I am already, even though it is barely past mid-June. There's a very distinct like, is the Reverend wearing a watch? No, that's just a band on their skin. And so, but even back then, I was kind of aware like you don't just learn about something in another culture and order it, right? Like you don't do that. That's some appropriation that can be highly offensive to people. And back then, like, I wasn't quite sure if it would be offensive. But I just wanted to say, like, I've dreamed of a suit like this since then. And what's nice is because I guess, like, things hit toddler fashion and then they hit adult fashion. Because I've seen rash suits for kids for a long time where it's like basically it looks like a wetsuit, but it's not, right? It's really thin. You can go swim in it. It's easy to get on and off. And theirs has like a whole front zip. Well, now they're starting to make rash guard suits for women. And I'm like, yay. So I actually have this really nice, like it's short. So, I'm still showing some ankle and being a little scandalous there. But, it's got like the long sleeves and a zip up. And I've like never been more excited about wearing a swimsuit, I think, in my whole life.
Oh,
like
man.
ever. This even like goes beyond. I almost said Trumps. It's so funny how I'm trying to like work that out of my verbiage. This almost goes beyond like when I got permission for a 2-piece, like as a kid, because there was something I was like, oh my god, I'm a big kid because they're letting me wear a 2-piece. Like there was that for a minute for me, but like when I really unpacked it, I never really wanted to show off my skin and stuff. Like right, like I went through little phases of it because I thought that's what it meant to be an adult. But then, like, now, like, later in life, it's like, I'm kind of over it now. Like, I'm cool. Like, other people doing their thing, it's fine. Like, you do you. But for me, I don't want to anymore. I like keeping my stuff to myself. But yeah, so I'm pretty excited. It's actually like pretty, like you can see it in the background, in my awesomely always organized home where it is not in a pile on the floor behind my shoulder because that's where it landed after I tried it on excitedly yesterday.
Totally folded, neated, and everything. Yeah.
Right, because I am perfect at maintaining that clutter-free life that I have mentioned more than once helps with mental health. Like, actually, our place is pretty clean. There's obviously cluttered spots, but I did want to say the child, I don't know, I almost want to update. I'll still call him the baby Reverend for a while probably, but the baby Reverend has made some friends. And houses that have 2 or 3 kids, totally understand with all the things going on, like how a house, they tend to be more cluttered, right? Like we could be real about that. That's not like a place of judgment. It's just a statement of fact. Like you have multiple humans living in the house. And if there's not like a really banger cleaning arrangement or the ability to afford a maid, you probably have some mess and clutter. And because, the Mr. Reverend and I are minimalists, we just don't have as much opportunity for clutter. So that's our way of mitigating that. We don't have the particularly messy home. We have messy places in our home, but not the overall home. And that's our choice. We just don't have couches, Tim. You know this. Like we're like that. We're floor couch people. And so like that alone makes your place look really clear and bare. And I just remember the first time this boy walked into my house, it's like, wow, it looks like a hotel room in here. And I'm like, I know you're not meaning to say like, wow, this looks sterile and unlived in, but that's like how my brain kind of took it. It's like, yeah, it is kind of clean. Like we don't have a lot of stuff, I promise the baby Reverend has toys. We're not like completely devoid of all of that stuff. we just keep it to a minimum so that he can actually clean them and not get frustrated, and then I don't have to clean them and then get frustrated.
But you will get a complimentary Reverend family mint by the time you leave.
Oh yes, of course. I will probably have homemade it, and it will likely have carob instead of chocolate. So. Anywho, summer is here. It's really kind of nice. It's really warm here as I adjust. People who have been following along for a bit know that we just relocated back from the other side of the country, back over here to the Tri-Cities areas. I'm not afraid to at least share that part of Washington, because it's like, what part of Washington, right? Depends very, very much on what your weather experience is. And so we're definitely in that drier side of it. So we've had the fires all around us. That's something I didn't miss about this side of the country, but it is what it is. But full season is among us, splash pad season is among us, and I am already an entirely different shade of human.
Yeah, I'm getting a little tannish myself, being outside with all the dogs. And heat-wise, we did have a couple of days at the beginning of the week where it was in the upper 90s, which meant that we were inside most of the day. And being inside with a bunch of dogs that want to be outside playing in the water, can be interesting. Let's put it that way.
Oh yeah, even this my skin puppy likes to play in the water. That's all he wants to do. He begs for sprinklers. We've had groundings around not being allowed to see sprinklers. He is the neighborhood sprinkler inspector. He likes to just go around. It's like, we could just walk around the neighborhood, just see what sprinklers are on. And it turns into me like, no, stop. That's private property. Stop touching it. Stop it. It's not yours.
But I want it.
Well, it only gets me whenever, because the sprinkler heads, you can change the direction of it, some of them, by just turning it. And he turned one at the church parking lot. It started hitting a car. I'm like, chit. Just turned it back really quick. I was like, yeah, you can't touch those anymore. Don't touch the actual sprinkler, because I didn't know. I'm not a sprinkler tech. I've never been so fascinated by them to mess with them before. I just know they pop up and they make water happen and then they go away. And then he is sad because he wants the sprinklers on all the time. I was like, well, if the sprinklers are on all the time, we wouldn't have any water anymore, buddy. So, we should make sure that we're happy that the sprinklers turn off.
Yes, indeed. Well, look at that, everybody. Our friends are here. Welcome to Friends Talking Nerdy. This is Tim the Nerd, and joining us, as you have heard, is the Reverend Tracy. And this week we have ourselves an interesting topic. What is it?
Yes, in true Reverend fashion, I'll probably talk way too long about it because it is something that interests me and has affected me personally, and that is going into the psychology of the divorced dad. I've really appreciated being able to go into the psychology of stepmothers last month, but when Tim and I talked about it, going back into the stepdad psychology was probably going to be a lot of the same things. But stepdads, they do have their unique experience, don't get me wrong. But I do think Tim's right that when we came together and discussed it, a lot of it felt like it was covered under stepmoms. So kind of this felt like the more appropriate counter to the stepmom episode, because whereas people don't feel comfortable talking about the stepmom's mental health being prioritized in those situations and family schematics, we also really have a hard time talking about the mental health of our divorced dads, right? And it makes sense. I want to go ahead and preface it. Of course, it makes sense that it's hard to talk about these things as if they're important, because we have a hard time talking about something being important and not making it feel like we're saying something else is therefore less important. That is not how these things work, though. Like, if we want to find solutions that's going to help our overall cultural mental health, and especially our family unit mental health, we need to talk about all of it and not just push it down and not talk about it. Which is funny that we do this to our divorced dads, because we just learned about alexithymia, and that's not good. The pushing down and saying that this isn't important or doesn't like merit discussion is not good, and it's not doing justice by this. So therefore, this felt like the best topic to kind of counter our stepmoms episode for the mental health that we are doing of moms and then dads for these last 2 months.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of touched upon it in previous episodes too. I mean, society, at least in America, I can't speak for elsewhere, is not kind to divorced dads. They're just not. A lot
Right.
of times, divorced dads do. There are some divorced dads out there that do deserve some condemnation or whatever. Let's put it that way. But I think there are too many, and you see it in the social media sphere all the time, that are quick to say, who cares about the divorced dad? Who cares? If they're providing, then they're doing the right thing. If they're not, then who cares about what they do? And it's those kind of blanket statements, I guess, that have always kind of ruffled my feathers. Let's put it that way. And I know that type of stuff doesn't sit well with you. What is that old phrase you used to say? There are only absolutes with the Sith, or something like that.
It is the way of the Sith to deal in absolutes. I'm pretty sure that's still the quote. Over years, I don't watch it a lot, so I may not be saying it exactly right. But yeah, this is something that hits home with me. I am the daughter, the child of a divorced dad. I am the spouse, because spoiler alert, I'm a stepmom, which means I'm the spouse of a divorced dad. Right. And I'm not saying like all of these things apply to like both of those humans or to every divorced dad ever. Right. It's just like not all of the stepmom stuff applies to every stepmom. But I do think it's important to talk about the things that are statistically high that seem to really be affecting the mental health of somebody who's actually really important for our kids, right? We've already touched, of course, some of this is going to be a little bit of repeat information lightly, just in case you've just stepped into this episode because this is the one that is of your interest. But, we've already talked about fathers matter, like not just for themselves, they matter for the kids. So, really, when we talk about parental mental health, and I really wanted to remind us at the top of this episode, when we talk about our divorced father demographics mental health, we are really talking about things that affect our children's mental health. So if we can go into this topic, remembering that ultimately we're talking about the family unit and therefore ultimately talking about better outcomes for our kids, I think it's worth getting uncomfortable and bringing up a topic, even if it might piss some people off. And I'm hoping it doesn't. That's never our goal here. But there's some controversial things that are going to be brought up in this episode, and I just want you guys to be prepared mentally to breathe through that and try to hear to the end if you're going to start with the topic. Hear me out, basically, is what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, and as I've said on the show before too, I'm a divorced dad myself. Hello, and this whole experience is not going to be, men are great, women are bad, blah blah blah.
No.
It's going to be I hate to use this term, but fair and balanced look at the divorced dad situation in this country, because yeah, fathers are important, and we have a society that kind of rewards divorced moms to be more vicious, and I think the studies do show that when that is allowed to happen, who suffers? The kids. They suffer more than anything else.
Right. And I will go back to, I do think we're on an overcorrection right now, because historically speaking, men with money used to be able to take children away from mothers. And that's not right either. Now, my only thing I'll say in hindsight of realizing we've done this episode is, man, I do wish we had kind of highlighted the mental health of the single mom, like the single mom. But you know what? We got 5 weeks of Father's Day and we got 4 weeks for Mother's Day, and we did the best we could with those. But maybe that gives us something that we can do in a future episode, because I'm not against talking about it, because that is a demographic that deserves to have their story heard as well. This is just what wound up shaking up whenever we decided on topics for the mental health of our fathers for this year.
Indeed. Indeed. So start us on this journey.
Yeah, let's get into it. So let's start with talking about the fact that divorce is more than just the end of a marriage, right? I think people often talk about divorce as if it's really just the end of a romantic relationship. And sure, that can be the case, right? Like my first husband and I, like we didn't have children. We had a dog, and, we made the decision on that, and some people do, like, put that decision pretty high up there. For me, it was easy because it was his first dog, right? So he got to keep his dog. But, for many fathers, divorce represents the loss of multiple identities simultaneously. And if you guys have heard any of the shows at all, you know how often I accidentally go off ad nauseum about something called identity threat. So that's something that you should just kind of keep in the back of your head, is the Reverend going, ding, identity threat, throughout this episode, because this is all going to be a constant, like, I would have to say, after my experience and preparing for this episode, I would say the number one thing that constantly chips at that divorced dad's mental health is identity threat related. And I think once we go through this together, you might agree with me, because I didn't go into it trying to prove that, but I came out of it thinking that, which is kind of the way you want to almost form opinions, right? It's how
Hmm.
you combat bias. But when most people hear divorce, they picture a couple separating. But psychologically, there's often much more happening there. A father may be grieving, daily access to the children that were in his life, routines that he had, traditions he held, the financial stability that came from like being one unit. Tim's nodding. Social connections. We talked about, how fathers tend to like lose a lot of their social connections when they become married and have kids. Future planning that may have been going on, and a version of himself that he expected to become. Humans don't just grieve people, we grieve identities. And we know when we lose that, it physically hurts. We've talked about that. And sometimes a divorced dad isn't only mourning a marriage, he's mourning the life that he really thought that he was building. And I think that's something a lot of people can really like, that makes sense, right? Like, and that's not to say, obviously, there's a little bit of asterisk here that a lot of this is going to apply to the mom as well. But with our focus being on the dad today, this one, we're just trying to give that understanding of that mental piece. And especially when you consider that a lot of men's career choices kind of get based on their family life. Like if they've made significant pivots for that, that can be even more identity sticking. I could see that one. But yeah, there is a psychologist named Paulina Boss, and she developed a concept called ambiguous loss. I knew I was
You
going to
did
mess
it.
that up.
You did it.
I practiced it, and I just had to trip over it the first time just to prove that I could still mess it up. Ambiguous loss, and that occurs when something remains present but fundamentally changed. And so, like, divorced fathers still have children. They still love those children, but their role is suddenly going to look very differently, especially if it's following the statistical path of the kids very suddenly just live with a mom and dad becomes a visiting parent. And that kind of loss can be psychologically complicated because there isn't always a clear ending or resolution, right? It's not like you finish the paperwork and then suddenly, boom, like you're good. There's still other pivots and changes that can continually happen in that relationship, mostly because it being outside of your home so much. There's an awareness of how little control you have over those relationships, right? Like it's harder to maintain when you're not around people as much as when you are around them constantly, right? You can probably speak more to this as far as being around your kids and not being around your kids.
Yeah, I know when the divorce happened and finally got in my new place and slept on my lovely futon. Remember that? What got me first was the silence. Being in that room and just the silence because I had three kids and a very loud ex-wife, let's put it that way. I could be loud myself too, people, not throwing total shade here, but just the silence is what really affected me at first, because it was almost like washing over you in a way. And I think that might have been part of the reason why I was so intent on like dating, just going out and doing stuff, just getting, people in my life, to not have that. But then, speaking about the relationships as well, like I had up to that point, a relatively decent, relationship with my daughter, I thought at the time. But then within a matter of a couple of months after the divorce, that's when she stopped speaking to me because, again, I was going out and dating and posting pictures up on Facebook and whatnot. And, it's like on the one hand, I shouldn't have felt bad for doing that per se, but I also didn't think about what her reaction would have been as well. I don't know if, my daughter had, some sort of a thing in her head that maybe, me and her mother would get back together at some point or what. But, just suddenly not being able to be there with her, because if I had been there with her when she was first upset, it's like I felt I could have easily have been able to sit down with her and talk to her more, but that wasn't able to happen at that point. And she was, I believe, 16 at that point too. So if she didn't want to come see me and spend, a weekend or whatever, she didn't have to at that point. And, I wasn't going to, force, a 16-year-old at that point. If she was 5, different story, she'd be coming over. But, it definitely changed the dynamic of that relationship.
Yeah, of course it does, right? It goes back to what and who you spend your time around is going to be that factor of what keeps those relationships strong. And now, granted, there's also times have changed, right? You have more ability to be connected. When I was a kid, I don't know, a phone call would have been so awkward in the middle of the week. So I truly only saw my father every other weekend. And that was the most I talked to him. Because, it's not like what you've got nowadays where you can get on and this is some of the positive stuff that I don't mind sharing about the Mr. Reverend, that he can get on and play Call of Duty with his kids and connect in those ways. So they're not just having a phone conversation, they're playing a game and they're problem solving and they're doing something together. There is something psychological about that. You can like gaming, you can not like gaming, but it is a connector and it is something that you can do together. Not just between parent and child, but between other children, to be social. It's not all bad.
Or even something like text messaging, with older kids as well. If you got a 5-year-old and you're sending a text message, that's kind of a dick move. But I mean, if your kids are teenagers or something like that, text messaging can be great to just have those, off the cuff conversations whenever, wherever, because some people, believe it or not, do kind of prefer the text messaging way as a primary thing. Because, if I had to sit back and even call my oldest now, it would be, hi, do you remember
right.
this? Yeah.
And I guess some of that is pebbling, right? We've learned about pebbling. I want to say most people kind of get that concept now. That's where you give small little things and memes and pictures to somebody just to show that you care. And it really allows that ability too. But the thing is the child has to be comfortable doing that. The child has to feel like their relationship with the other parent is supported enough to do that. So I very honestly cannot say that if I had had the technology that we do now, if things would have fared any differently between me and my father. Because there was, and I might touch on it a little bit more later, because to be abundantly clear about anything with me, for the most part, I'm going to be talking about my experience with my father. Being the daughter of a divorced dad is the perspective I'm bringing to this, more than being the spouse of a divorced father, just to clearly state my intent there. But, I don't know if that would have mattered. Because I very much knew Karen's opinion of Frank. I very much knew that in her world, she divorced him because he cheated on her, which, according to him, is not true. But I mean, who's going to admit to it? And I do kind of lean towards I don't think it was true, but that's just my opinion. But at the same time, those were not appropriate things to share with me. But at that rate, I think it would have been, I would have felt very self-conscious randomly talking to, randomly texting, or randomly engaging with my father. Because when you live in that household, you're going to feel judged by the parent you're around the most, right? So that made it hard for me to express anything about it. And those are the things that can tear that away like that. And that probably could have been a factor as to why that was so quick for you. Because it doesn't really take that much to influence, because your children, rightfully so, really look up to you and they want to hear when you're trying to effectively warn them about somebody. But it's our job as the adults and the parents to temper Are we actually warning them about something that's truly dangerous to them, or are we trying to get somebody to be our friend and be on our side? And it's really tempting and tasty to do the second thing, but that's not the thing that's going to be good for your kids. So just because that kind of separation, that there's actually numbers out there as far as how soon sometimes kids end up not speaking to their parents anymore into divorces. And it's interesting to talk about because it happens so much. And so it was just interesting that you happened to share a story of how quick it went from good relationship to very suddenly bad. And then, of course, it makes you go, well, was it because I was dating? Were there other factors? And there's things that you'll just never honestly know, right?
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, there's no such thing as a time machine. You're not going to be able to go back and be like, oh, if I don't do this, then good things will happen at that point. Cause yeah, you'll just never know really. And that is really the sad part. And you also touched upon, and I'm sure we'll probably go into it in deeper, and, more broadly, but the whole idea of having one parent constantly badmouth the other parent in front of the kid. I know my mother did that to me tremendously with my father. Now,
Right.
granted, the older because when I was a kid, I idolized my dad. But then, the older I got, the more I realized, yeah, you know what? My mom was kind of right about him. He wasn't that good of a guy. But
you needed to make that decision.
exactly.
And that's the thing, especially when it comes to the parents and these other relationships. Like, you can be supportive, but protective does not mean swaying, right? And granted, I think there is more awareness about this now, but I think the problem is we still face it because, and we've talked about this before, our culture doesn't teach healthy breakups. And because with our culture with kids right now, we are a little bit pendulum placement of being a little bit more maybe friendly than parental and doing the boundaries and the discipline. Like, I'm not saying all, I'm just saying it seems to be a lot of people are a little bit more buddy-buddy with their kids now. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But basically, our culture spends a lot of time teaching people how to get together and no time, how to healthily separate. And I think because our relationships with our kids right now are in a pendulum swing where we are a little more friendly. And I'm not saying that's bad. I am saying that being friendly with your kids still needs to have that caveat of you really do need to have an especially fine-tuned filter of what you're going to say about them in front of them about their other parent, whether you live in the same home or not. Because we've already talked about kids are incredibly attuned to emotions and reading body language. Like, this is all stuff that they are very good at because their little body survival relies on it. So if we aren't going to get better about teaching people how to break up better, we have to work on grooming what we are sharing in front of our kids. Like, we have to be better. It is not good enough. Well, I don't say that their mother's a blah, blah, blah piece of and likely goes out to the lates of the nights, like with no pants on. Like, that's great that you're not saying those very apparently bad things, but you also need to be like, oh my God, that person just drives me crazy. Or, oh my gosh, I swear I need a drink just to talk to them. It's those little things that I don't think parents realize how perceptive kids are to put together what they mean. And you've got to breathe through. It's okay to admit that you're stressed. It's even times like someone's stressing me out right now, to let them know that it's not them, right? Because that's also part of what they're reading for. So they do want an answer as to what's wrong. But you know what I mean? Like, so as a culture, I do, and I've expressed this wish more than once. I wish we could just learn how to break up healthier, because I think that would do tremendous leaps and bounds for the mental health of the children involved in breakups of parents. Because when we have no practice getting along when children aren't involved, it's going to be very difficult nailing it when you're dealing with divorce and children.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I first met my ex-wife, one of the things I was like, when we were getting married, I was like, I think we should get a prenuptial agreement. And, and at that point, she was like, well, she took a look at my job at the time. And yeah, I was not rich by any way, shape, or form. But my whole point was, having some sort of a legal thing at the start to kind of, say that if, a breakup were to occur somewhere down the line, then the breakup would be equitable and, we'd be able to walk away happy. But she ended up just joking around like, oh, I'm going to take your video game collection. I'm going to take your DVDs, to the point where I ended up dropping it. And then who ends up getting screwed? This guy right here,
That is a little bit of a thing with the family courts right now, right? And like, what's funny is she probably felt totally empowered to do that because it goes back into we don't have we've got dating advice and relationship books and romantic movies that have their own toxic messages in them. Side note, wedding industries, but we don't have a lot that teaches people how to transition from romantic partners to practical partners, aka parenting partners if you needed to, right? Look at how bad, like, we just say don't date at work. Meanwhile, if we had a more mature mentality around breaking up, if you think about it, dating at work wouldn't really be a problem because we'd have the skills required to transition from romantic to practical. And instead, the culture spirit,
sometimes.
sometimes, well, I'm saying if we had practice, that probably wouldn't be so much of a, don't shit where you eat thing, like don't date where you work is kind of a thing. But the only reason that's a thing is because of this emotional immaturity around breaking up. Right? Because the cultural script is find the villain, not find a healthy way forward. Right? And we've had more practice with that. And it even talks about like one of my issues with our dating culture is that we can't just be honest and break up when it's time to break up for you. We've got to wait until they cross a line or do something so bad, because if you break up with them for no reason, you suck. Right? Like you're not allowed to just break up with somebody because you don't want to be with them. Like there has to be a reason. And as long as that's in our culture, we're going to have a really hard time finding parents who can just honestly say, this relationship is not working for us. We should find a way to split amicably. Like there's not going to be space for that. There's going to be more pressure that dad needs to find something so bad about that mom, or that mom needs to find something so bad about that dad to justify what they're doing. Otherwise, they're bad parents because they didn't even think of the kids. And then what about just breaking up with somebody for no reason? We do think that that's bad behavior, right? Like we do kind of frown upon that.
And I think it is partly due to society stating that if you get into a relationship, it would be forever. And I think you slightly touched upon that with the romantic movies and all that stuff. People have this mindset that if they are going to be in a relationship, it will last forever. It will never die and stuff like that. And statistically speaking, no, you're probably wrong. It's great if you can be the exception to the rule, but most relationships at some point will have some sort of an ending.
Exactly. Some way or another. And I think like I had joked a lot with the Mr. Reverend, not about a prenuptial agreement, but I had joked about a prenatal agreement. And this goes back into my personal experience with family court and divorced family from my childhood, was that I didn't want it. I don't want any of the drama with any of that. Now, granted, I do think that if anything did happen between us, I think we'd figure out a way to work out the ways that we talked about it, right? We have our own incentives for wanting to work together in that sense and our own inspirations. But yes, just to kind of wrap up that little thought before moving on into the next topic, there's something called family systems theory, and that's developed by Murray Bowen, and it emphasizes that conflict between adults rarely stays between the adults. It affects the emotional systems all around them. And research consistently finds that high interparental conflict predicts poorer child outcomes more strongly than divorce itself. The strongest predictor often isn't the separation, it's the unresolved conflict that follows it. And that's what's funny is we have couples therapy for staying together. But my experience is more often teaching me, and this goes back to my parents fighting constantly, like, no, they didn't interact. Because anytime they were within 2 feet of each other, they were just like two dogs with a fence separating them. You know how they can be like crazy aggressive. Like they're not actually going to bite each other. But like, oh my gosh, you could just feel it all. And the thing is like, whether they were saying anything or not, we felt that as kids. And so it makes me go like, I really think with what we understand nowadays, that kids' nervous systems are just so perceptive to this, that if there's a whiff of high conflict in the divorce proceedings, like, why aren't we mandating therapy between the parents?
Even
I
individual therapy, yeah.
Well, individual, and honestly, I could see like they do actually make co-parenting therapy. There are people out there that specialize in this, and I think that it should be upon the responsibility of the family court, if it's supposedly for what's best for the kids, to identify these high conflict situation where these parents need help. Note, I'm not saying they're bad. I'm saying the culture really does set up this recipe for this really crappy soup when it comes to being in that situation. And I refuse to blame the parents that are just being told that this is what you do. However, I do think that it should be upon the family court system to help identify some of this, because they would be the ones to know. And maybe that could be a good intervention. For example, they do mandate therapy. They do it all the time when you have DUIs, when you even have a domestic violence thing, you have to take classes and therapy and all that. So they can. But it makes me go, and this is to my experience, I wish somebody would have helped more, because even with them trying like their best, I guess at the time with their emotional tools, we were extremely in the know of how much those two hated each other. Like both of us as kids knew. And so it really seems like if you're doing anything for the kids, it is, and I'm not saying you have to go back to braiding each other's back hairs, but you've got to find a way to cut that tension between you guys to find a way to parent together. Now, I get it. There are assholes out there. I get it. There are people, but I go back to, I wish there were ways to identify it to get therapeutic intervention, because this is about the outcome for the kids, not necessarily like the adult either.
It in that case, like I get that, and I think that also kind of shows kind of the drawback of the American healthcare system, because there are going to be some people that financially might not be able to find some of these, specialized therapists in terms of like a co-parenting thing, and may only be able to take advantage of, let's say, the therapy they can get from like a college student who needs the hours in
Yeah.
order to be able to help out. But, also too, just some people just want to be mean. Like, I know when I first split, I didn't say much or anything to my kids about my ex-wife at all. But then I found out after a good couple of years that not only was my ex-wife grilling my kids about what life was like for me as a divorced person, like she was just ripping into them and kind of doing what my mother used to do with me, of, if one of the kids got sideways with her, you're just like your father.
God, yeah. I
Yeah.
know one of the things with me was they'd call me Karen. I'd get called Karen, and they knew how much I didn't like her. I was not, yeah, my bio mom trying to constantly talk shit on my dad actually made me really like her a lot less. Like, there was also how she treated me directly, don't get me wrong, but that did not help, because I, like, from the go was like, your fault. It is your fault he's gone. It is your fault he's not here for bath time. And I was really young when it happened, so I don't really remember the bath times and stuff, if that makes sense. But I got eventually this very big awareness that he didn't get to be in my life every day anymore because of her. Right. So it just kind of like compiled on that. And then now, who knows? Maybe things could have gone differently for me if awareness was more there, and say they could have eventually just not been as mad anymore. Because that's the thing, is when there's not kids, it does seem a little bit more likely that sometimes after time passes, people can cool their heels. But I think it's because like you have to interact with each other, that there's a resentfulness that builds. And I think that's what makes it so hard for like divorced parents to find a way to work together well enough and find like the partnership that's not a romantic partnership, because at the end of the day, you are both still very much going to affect the mental health and the well-being of your kids, whether you're in the same home or outside of. It just looks different, but it's still ideally should be teamwork where it can. And if you can tap into that at all to work through whatever fight you've had, I would really suggest doing it. I go back to, obviously, if you left in a situation of like abuse, etc. Like there's things that warrant it. However, in those situations, typically the court's not going to give time to that person. So it does sometimes make me wonder if that should be a logic factor. Now, I know our courts aren't perfect, okay? But I know sometimes when you really just find yourself wanting to hate, it doesn't hurt to look for green flags, right? And we've kind of talked about this concept in the Mother's Day and previously in Father's Day too, is when you just want to campaign against you as an adult child to your much older parents at this point, right? Because either the grandparent ages in these demographics, when you find that you're only wanting to invest in a negative narrative, it doesn't actually hurt to try to look for green flags and try to fight the idea that whoever it is in your brain is some like screaming narcissist, right? Because we go back to that is extremely rare for that to exist. And it sure does feel nice to not feel like somebody was mean to you because they actually just wanted to be. But anywho, the next topic I wanted to get into with fathers and everything is actually almost a play off of something we talked about when a father becomes a father, right? We talked about how you brought up that it can be lonely because you tend to trade a lot of your friendships. And so one of the least discussed aspects of divorce for many fathers is a return of the loneliness. And it looks different this time because many men build large portions of their social life around work and marriage and fatherhood, right? They unpack and offload some of those friendships. We talked about that. So when divorce occurs, multiple sources of connection can disappear all at once. And you don't necessarily have that core fallback that you had before you got into the relationship, especially depending on how long it's been. Those people move on. They physically move locations, or sometimes they're in relationships now themselves, right? But what's interesting is that a man can still have coworkers and still have friends and still have family and still feel profoundly alone, because being around people isn't the same thing as feeling emotionally connected to people. So all of the things that in our prior episode that we've talked about, dads tend to trade off so that they can focus on their family, right? Because the message is you need to be successful in your career, but your time does matter around your child. Attachment theory, we've discovered it. It matters. You need to be around them too. So what you end up cutting is all of those relationships, right?
Right.
And when this now suddenly shifts, you don't have the fallback of relationships. Now, the guy that's skirting around and gone every Friday night and missing every kid's recitals because he's hanging out with his friends or doing this with these people, he's probably fine. But the guy that actually loves and cares about his kids, which is like most dudes that become fathers, it is a real vacuum. Like you talked about, the quiet, like it feels empty. And I guess I will share at least this much of my experience as a spouse to a divorced dad. Even when they're over every other weekend, that sudden quiet can get you. And then like finding the toy that didn't get put up is like a grief almost. Like people kind of have this idea of the household of the other parent, because that's often how dads get delegated or designated in these situations, but that the other household like somehow has some kind of party and it's like, oh yay, kid-free life, I am happy. And I will tell you from my perspective, both now being married to, and I, fun fact, have also had a history of dating men who have kids. I know, Tim, you weren't necessarily doing visitation or anything, but I've dated men who did have the every other weekend thing. And that has literally never been my experience. It is always like almost like a brief grieving period each time. And that's like a cyclical thing then for our divorced dads. So that means like every other weekend, they're experiencing a loss and a grief again. But again, their kids are still alive. They're still around. They're just not home anymore.
In some ways, too, like what I found is that it really quickly makes you kind of readjust how you saw yourself as a parent as well. You know, like there were like when I was, you know, with the ex-wife and the kids were there and all that, there were a lot of times the kids would do stuff and I'd be annoyed. Nah, don't do this. Blah, blah, blah. You know, but suddenly being on your own and having that silence, you just start thinking of, did I really need to do that? It's like I was started becoming really self-critical about, my parenting skills at that particular time. And, obviously realizing that it wasn't going to go back to, I was not going to go back with the ex-wife and, kind of resume things at that point. It was just like, okay, like in a lot of ways, I felt like you know, there was I had plenty of time with the kids, but I wish I had more to make up for what I ended up missing, if that makes sense too. Because yeah, it's just you think of all those little mistakes that you made as a parent when you are in that room alone, and I think that was a journey I needed, but it's a journey that is kind of a long, dark path to go through.
Yeah, and it actually kind of naturally transitioned us into the next topic, right? Because when fatherhood becomes part time, one of the hardest adjustments for many divorced fathers is learning how to be a father inside of a structure they didn't choose. And we do have to keep in mind, in a way, because of our cultural shift to insist more quality time with dads, I would argue that this is worse now for fathers than it used to be. Because before, where a father's role was definitely more on making the money and less on coming home and playing, now you actually have memories and routines built around coming home and playing with your kids after school or after work. You have like that you have your dad duty, like Tuesday night's dad's dinner night, and you're cooking with your kids or what, like things that kind of happen. I'm not obviously not everybody has a night of the week where dad cooks dinner with the kids. I'm just saying because fathers are encouraged to do more of these quality time things with their kids, I would dare say that becoming a part-time father is harder on modern dads potentially than dads before, because dads before really did have the you make money, you're good, and you can still do that outside of the house. Like, yeah, sure, you still maybe suffered silently that you missed your kids, but the implied value on you is still being met. But how do you keep meeting the personal time when you're not there physically, right? No dad, especially modern dads, dreams about becoming a weekend dad. Nobody imagines counting days until the next custody exchange, and yet many fathers find themselves trying to compress parenting into limited windows of time. That creates enormous pressure. Every weekend feels important. Every visit feels important. Every conversation feels important. But parenting isn't built only from major moments. It's built from ordinary ones too. It's from doing homework together, having dinner, car rides, bedtime stories. Those everyday interactions matter. And this is going to go back into that developmental psychologist, Michael Lamb. And he's helped transform fatherhood research by demonstrating that fathers are not merely providers. They are, in fact, attachment figures. They have their own importance, just like a mom does. And research consistently finds that positive father child relationships are associated with improved emotional regulation, better academic outcomes, greater self esteem, and lower behavioral problems. The quality matters, not just the presence. And what's funny is there is even old Jungian quotes from Carl Jung about the importance of the father relationship. Now, granted, now we know that he may have been talking a bit about Freud when he was talking about that father relationship, because when we nerded out over the history of psychology. But this has long been talked about. But we do have people that are measuring it and trying to really make it its own standalone facts now. But so what's been suspect, there are findings showing that this matters. So dads out there, yes, you're not crazy for feeling like earning money and sending it isn't enough, because it's often not. And I'm so sorry if you're having to find creative ways to stay connected and find ways to be like important with and to your kids so that your children know that they're important to you.
But the effort that the divorced dads, the ones that you were just talking to, put in by doing that stuff, I think down the road can help their kids as well. Because you don't want to be bitter. You don't want to badmouth. Like my kids are old enough that, I'm a little more free about, saying my piece about my ex-wife at this particular time. Like if they were teenagers, I wouldn't do it. They're all in their 20s now. So yeah, I can be a little more honest, but like, I think it is an example. Like, like I lost out on, the rest of their childhood into adulthood in terms of physically being in that building with them. But like, you can still matter to them. It's just it kind of changing in your head the goal, if that makes sense, because initially, when you're with the ex-wife and you're raising the kids, you think the goal is just let them have them grow up and then grow out and be good human beings. But it does become different, because you can't be the lecturing father, you can't be the disciplining father when you're living on your own. At that point it has to change. Like, I know my youngest was at first, like, thinking I was going to be like the disciplining father and be the yelly type, because I was a yelly type. Living with my ex-wife, he'd be yelling too. But but he ended up, I think, becoming a little more free, being able to talk to me, because I wasn't, what I was when I lived with him. I became better. And, it's like there was a loss, yes, but there was stuff gained as well. And I think, try to think of the positives that can come from this type of situation, and go with those positives. Don't focus or simmer on the negatives.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, like, I just remember, like, I was of the age that, Frank figured, at 18, I can tell them my side. I'll just wait for an age number to pass. And it was super funny, as I still remember being sat down at 18. Like, all right, I'm going to tell you my perspective on why the divorce happened. As if my brother, who turned 18 a year and a half before, didn't already tell me. But I appreciate it, though, because he tried to do what was right, even back in those days, in that standard. And that would have been, early aughts that I would have been turning 18, right? So 2003. But and it wasn't because I had that parallel, and I did appreciate that he tried. I'm not sure waiting for the legality of adulthood is necessarily appropriate either, because these relationships matter into adulthood, right? Like, it's not good to then turn around and trash the relationship with the mother either. That has its own statistical fallout, right? Like, things that happen. But yeah, like, you don't want to do either one of those. But that being said, yeah, like, fathers don't plan on being part-time. They don't plan on their home being abruptly quiet. And I do think that is why dads in these situations do tend to dirt. They tend to dirt earlier. They tend to date earlier and faster into it than, and honestly, that flips depending on who has custody. By the way, like, whoever gets, like, full-time parenting, and we'll get into some of that, my opinion on that one later. And I know we're getting closer to the end of this, but there is some stuff here at the tail end that will cover it. But God, I totally forgot what I was getting into there. I hate when I space like that.
About dating.
Because they date faster and everything. But, like, when the father is the situation where they've got the full-time schedule, like, the parenting time is primarily with that parent, it's the other way. It can be the woman that dates, and a lot of it is trying to fill that emotional hole. It's easier nowadays to slip on a dating app and suddenly you have people to interact with than to go out and find the friends that you offloaded when you had children. Right? So I totally understand why fathers tend to date. I totally understand how a child takes it as you're trying to replace and move on too fast. Both are valid. Right? And we can't really expect the younger children to understand, well, daddy's just really lonely and he doesn't have us around anymore and he doesn't have mommy and he got rid of all of his friends. It's like, we can't like really realistically have that level of expecting them to have that understanding that you're just lonely. It's not that you're trying to replace them. It's that it is physically quiet, and you can't fix other elements of it. Right? You can't fix the, emotional attachment stuff that you also want to be with your kids and can't, but you can at least replace it. And then I think because that part can be replaced almost, it kind of compounds a little bit on the next point that we already touched on. And that is, the good dad is a provider, right? The provider trap. And we've talked about this before with contingent value, right? But one of the most powerful messages many divorced fathers especially receive is that their value is measured primarily by what they can provide financially. So if it was bad enough as a father, it definitely seems to be way more pressure when you get divorced that your job is definitely to make money. And this is where it's kind of flipped. When you're a married dad, it is you need to provide money, but you also better be doing that quality time because that's important. But for some reason, when the divorce happens, it seems like our culture is dropping the importance of the quality time now and are now more emphasizing the importance of the making money. Because to be clear, providing matters, right? We can look at the opportunity atlas and things like that. We do have to accept that financial income does matter. Supporting your children matters. Financial stability matters. The problem begins when financial contribution becomes the only measure of contribution, because fatherhood isn't just economics. It is attachment. There is important guidance, especially in the teen years, it seems, for our children. And not just the boys, the girls too. It's connection, it's support, it's presence. Yet many fathers report receiving a message from society, former partners, and sometimes the legal system that if you're paying, you're parenting. And those are not the same things. Psychologists refer to this as contingent self-worth. There's that concept. We brought it up before. And that's a person's value becomes tied to a specific condition. And for many fathers, those conditions become income, productivity, and provision. And the danger is that financial struggles stop feeling like financial struggles and start feeling like personal failures. Because now when you're not making money, you are failing in the parental role you are still allowed to have with your kids very freely at this point. And that's one of the reasons there's a lot of fathers advocacy organizations that are gaining traction. Because whether someone agrees with every position they take or not, their existence reflects a real experience many fathers report, feeling that their emotional role as a parent is undervalued compared to their financial role. And also, it makes sense when these advocacy groups get brought in when somebody is starting to be financially impacted, and especially when there seems to be a system that makes a little bit of money off people being financially impacted. Because if you have any feelings that our court system is crooked at all, but you're not willing to put that same lens on our family court system, maybe because it went in a way that favored you, maybe because you've had no reason to really question it or just want to assume they're doing best by the kids. But if you're not willing to put that same skeptical lens over that area of the court, question that. Because yes, they do make money. Lawyers make money by the culture that encourages two parents to fight. Therefore, the court system makes money off of the culture that encourages parents to fight. Because that's the other thing is, I know with my father, one thing that really shook him was that I wanted to live with him full time. But as an immigrant from Germany, who the best he could do is, I mean, he was doing great at the post office, but he knew he couldn't afford a lawyer. Now, he didn't say it in front of me, but I did hear it at one point that he wanted to but didn't know how. And that's what led to, I will never forget the picnic table at the park conversation, where I just remember he tried to very politely ask Karen if I could just live with him because I wanted to. And she told him to go to hell, took me by my arm, spun me around, and said, "I'll see you in court. Not like you can afford it anyway." And took me away. And I don't think I will ever forget that. I know I didn't journal at the time, but there's no reason anyone would have told me that story to believe it. So I'm pretty sure that's true. So yeah, like there's also that part of it is even if you want more time with your kids, there's a demand there that you then have to make more money to change it.
And think about, too, all of the resources that are available for women legally that go through divorces that men just don't have.
And I
Men
go
just
back to
don't have
this,
it.
it's a very honest pendulum swing because women used to not have money. They used to be the one that was taken away from their family and their connections. But we go back to an overcorrection that does not make it right. And I just think this is where we're sitting, and this is why we like to have conversations like this.
Yeah, and with the fathers advocacy organizations out there, I think the skeptical person out there, might think that these types of groups might be like the incel type of groups out there, men are perfect, women are evil and stuff like that. And obviously I cannot in any way, shape or form, you cannot in any way, shape or form speak for every single one of these advocacy groups out there. But, it is important for groups like these if they are run properly, let's put it that way, to be out there to defend. Because, like, yeah, in my situation, like, if I had enough money to get get a good lawyer and to be able to have a decent home and whatnot, I could have had a decent chance to fight the ex-wife in court. I didn't. And I just had to deal with the hand that was dealt me. And and I've made it work barely, let's put it that way. But and also too, when it comes to providing and stuff like that, yes, providing is definitely important. Like, being unemployed for a significant amount of time, like, during the pandemic, was pretty bad for me. But it's like, providing is definitely important, but and I think most guys understand that. It's just the system is built in such a way to where there are extra incentives for women, if they are in the right mindset with the right type of lawyer, to just put the screws in, to make it far worse financially than what it would have been if they just sat down and talked it out or something.
Right. And you don't have to do just court, right? There's a lot of services out there. You can actually request mediation. You can even say, hey, this person's refusing to talk to me about this. Hey, court, I would like you to do court mandated mediation. A little bit more expensive, but they'll do it. There are, and you want to talk about therapies for this? Most states around, and I haven't looked at all of them, but I did try to do a general smattering to make sure I wasn't speaking too far out of place. But most of them actually do provide co-parenting counseling. Like, those services do exist. So they are there. They're just not being mandated as much as I wish they were. Granted, there's also the stickiness to that of when you're mandating stuff like that, it can easily be about them making money again. But I can't help but support this one, because at least this one is more likely to result in possibly not having to darken the door of family court every time something happens, over, well, now you're on the hook for lawyer fees, or now you're on the hook for court fees, or now you're on the hook for this. And now there's all of this stress because you're giving all this information and you have to do all these court dates by these demands and da-da-da-da, right? It seems like it would actually help stop the bleed a bit better to say, you guys, you came here and you were like this at each other, you have to do some form of co-parenting therapy. Because no, like I said, it just could be such a way to spot it and see it. And I go back to, yeah, sure, it is an expense, but so is taking therapy when you've had a DUI or something, right? That's an expense, but you still have to do it for the betterment of society. They would like you to not have another DUI thing where it could have been worse, where you could kill somebody, right? And so I guess I'm saying I don't see why the same mentality can't be applied to this, because wouldn't it save money over time? Because if the implied thing is these guys are going to keep darkening the door of the court system, and therefore, like, also making it busy and cluttered, so people who really need it can't get in. I don't know. That's just, it's an IMHO. That's totally in my humble opinion. It's just something I wish I would see more for being creative in some of these divorces when children are involved, right? Because this all goes into kind of our ending topics as we start to wrap up, as things that would help with topics like loyalty conflicts, alienating behaviors, and putting the child or the children in the middle, right? Because I think you could ask anybody on the street, they would agree. Children should never feel like loving one parent means betraying the other. And I can say factually that is how I felt. I don't know if Karen intended that impact, but I did feel like it was a betrayal to her for me to have such loving feelings for my dad. It made me feel like I couldn't talk about my weekends. I couldn't talk about good times we had, because if I did, there was just attitude from her where it seemed to upset her. And especially when I was younger, I didn't want to do that, right? Like, I didn't want to upset my mother, like, especially before, like, I didn't always dislike her, right? So of course I didn't want to upset her, so I just stopped talking about it. And so that can even lead yourself as a child to believe that you're not having a good time over there, because you're not you're not sharing the stories, right? And we do that when we have good times. We share with people we care about. And so you really need to be careful when your children are sharing stories about having a good time with their parent. You almost need to try to separate thinking of them as your ex and more as their parent, if that makes sense, as their friend. Because one of the saddest things that can happen after divorce is when children become caught in the adult conflict. And sometimes that conflict doesn't look like screaming. It looks like court filings. It doesn't look like dramatic fights. Sometimes it looks much quieter. A child notices who gets praised, who gets criticized, whose feelings matter, and whose perspective gets repeated. And over time, children can begin feeling like affection toward one parent somehow represents disloyalty toward the other. Kids are not dumb. And it goes back to this is exactly how their brains are wired to work in this phase of life. They pick up on emotional currents long before they understand the adult dynamics creating them. And that's where conversations about parental alienation often begin. And yes, I said the word. This is the word that upsets some people. It's the term called parental alienation. And it does remain one of the most controversial topics in family psychology right now. So this is where I'm going to touch on this. There are therapists, researchers, attorneys, and family court professionals who believe it represents a real and significant phenomenon. There are others who worry the concept can be misused, especially in situations involving abuse or legitimate safety concerns. And honestly, I think reasonable people can acknowledge both concerns. What feels less controversial are the behaviors. Researchers consistently discuss concerns around loyalty conflicts, gatekeeping behaviors, asking children to take sides, speaking negatively about a parent in front of a child, making children feel guilty for enjoying time with another parent, involving children in adult disputes. Regardless of what label we ultimately use, these behaviors can place children in emotionally impossible positions. Research consistently finds children generally benefit when safe, healthy relationships with loving parents are supported rather than undermined. And the way that I think about this is if your kid was having a fight with mom in the other room, like you're living together, in no world would you encourage that kid to not talk to that parent about it. In no world do you go into the other room and fight the kid's battle, right? Like you don't. When you're living all together, it seems so clear that the importance is that you need to help work with this kid on their relationship with the parent, not work on the relationship for the kid. Does that make sense? Like there's a difference there. And I think sometimes in divorce situations, especially when you are in high conflict, you do very naturally get protective of your children. And it makes sense. This is where I'm going to go that intent does not outweigh impact though.
Yeah. Yeah, like I remember as a kid myself, it felt like after weekends with my dad when I got home, it felt like a debriefing. It felt like my
Yeah.
mother would sit us down and kind of interview us about what the weekend was like. And like
Gosh.
early on, there were times to where she would actually call him up after the weekend, after talking to us about the weekend, and yell at him about certain stuff. And that did not go unnoticed. And at that point, I was started self-censoring about what, was said and what happened during that weekend and everything. And, that didn't help at all.
Man, it's like there's almost like the opposite sides of that that's just as damaging. You know what I mean? There's the interrogation and there's the I don't want to hear about it because I know like in my home experience, I sure did notice my week went a lot better with Karen when I had shit to say about Frank and Step Monster. And kids are smart. They put it together because they're trying to figure out how their world works. And by the way, it's important to note that this does not only apply to fathers. Mothers can experience it. Grandparents can experience it. Siblings can experience it. Entire branches of families can effectively disappear from a child's life following family conflict in court. And there is a documentary. I realized I came across it. Researchers like, that's right. I was waiting for this to come out and I'd forgotten about it because it was a YouTube thing and I'd seen the trailer. But it's called Erasing Family, and it's exploring stories from individuals who experience severe family estrangement during and after divorce. And whether someone agrees with all these conclusions presented in the documentary or not, it highlights how emotionally significant these ruptures can become for children and adults alike. And this is where I'm going to dust off and go into my personal story a little bit, because this is why parental alienation and estrangement and the family court system's damage that I feel like it does, intent or not, is real for me. Because this is actually one of the reasons interests me is because it affected me, right? When I started reading about loyalty conflict and parental alienation, I began seeing pieces of my own childhood in a clearer way than I feel like I experienced in the first go around. Now, I'm not saying my experience proves a theory, right? A sample size of one is not scientific. And I think you guys all know I have too much of an appreciation for how we actually do studies to say, I prove this. But I can say that many of the outcomes researchers associate with severe father-child estrangement showed up in my life in ways of abuse and in ways of like unhealthy relationships that kept manifesting, abusive relationships even. What's interesting is that my father actually doesn't seem particularly convinced that parental alienation is a thing. From his perspective, I think he largely views it that I was just making bad decisions after a conflict. We had a fight. I made bad decisions afterwards. And what's funny is those bad decisions for him, what he doesn't realize is the entire summer were being told to me by my bio mom that they were my big girl decisions. They were good decisions. I was making a good decision to not want to talk to him. I made a good decision to not go on summer break because of the fight that happened in our front yard. Because that's how quick it was. It was a fight in the front yard. I went inside and then they left for summer break because they were going to Colorado and they had no time to wait for my ass. And think about like how that probably felt for me. Like I actually watched them drive off. So it kind of got taken advantage of in a sense because then it was just me and her. And when you feel really bad about something and somebody is saying you're making a good decision, boy, it starts to feel like you're making a good decision, right? And but yeah, looking back from his perspective, looking back now though, I see a child who is repeatedly reassured that distancing herself from her father was understandable, acceptable, and supported. And as a child, I fell into that. Right? I don't think anyone involved fully appreciated what that distance might cost me over time. I don't think Karen knew this was going to set me up for some statistical things to happen. And even then, I've tried reconnecting as an adult, but at this point, I honestly think it would probably require therapeutic guidance and willingness from both sides to explore what happened because I've tried. I've tried to reach out. It's super interesting being a kid who recognizes that this happened to you and your parent, but the counterpart going, that didn't happen to me. It's almost like we were in a major car accident together and he got told it was just a minor fender bender. And I'm like, no, really, we rolled. We were in the hospital for 2 months. And it's like, nope, no, I don't care what you say. No, the scar, not from that. That's kind of what it almost feels like from the child side. And now there are children that, of course, don't believe in this, right? So I can't speak to that perspective. I can only speak to the perspective of being now the adult child that feels like I was successfully alienated because I do think in my situation it was on purpose that she didn't want me to talk to him anymore, right? That she seemed to support the idea of me never seeing or speaking to him again and said things to try and encourage that decision. And that is why I say in my case, yes, PA does fit. Is that in every case that a parent-child estrangement happens? No. But it is significant and it affects mental health. And even if you agree with the term PA or not, I'm hoping you can agree that loyalty conflicts, gatekeeping, asking children to take sides, speaking negatively about a parent, making children feel guilty are maybe bad. And I think as long as you can check and not do those things, whether or not you believe parental alienation syndrome is a thing or not, you're still going to be doing better for your kids. Whether or not you care about the mental health of the parent on the other side, your child matters for this one too, because this is one of those things where it affects both mental healths very directly.
And I think
God, clear your throat, Froggy.
Yeah. Yeah. Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey.
Hello, my honey. Hello, ragtime gal.
Yeah. And to be fair, and you've, talked about this before, it's like people in your parents' position, people in my mother's position, I've talked about my mother doing similar things. We can probably say with certainty that they weren't mustache twirling villains.
Oh, right.
It's like they were people that were high on the emotions of the situation of a split, and in the short term thinking that they were doing what was best for their kid, but not thinking about the long-term ramifications of that short-term, pleasure spike in the brain. And again, I'm not talking about, abusive parents or anything like that. For situations like this, it's like parents do have to go out of their way to try and think about the long-term ramifications, because too often, people are, in divorce situations. My ex-wife has done it, tried to, get the children to, high five, we're in this together, blah, 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 type of deal, thinking about the short-term victories, not thinking about the long-term damage that can offer when, the divorced parent in question could just bite their damn tongue,
Right. But that requires a level of emotional IQ that I don't feel is strongly groomed in our culture.
It's not groomed and it's not encouraged, especially at this point in time, in my opinion, for women.
And especially with exes. And that can be said of all the genders, right? This goes back into, I really do feel like a core of this problem comes from, we aren't taught that you can just break up with somebody and it not be that they're a bad guy. And when you feel that obligation to find the villain, well, then you start to identify as somebody who is a nemesis to this person. You know what I mean? And so and if I am telling divorced dad, in my head, my pretend person that I am divorced from and have this, like, I've divorced the Mr. Reverend, you know what I mean? And I am telling him that you are evil and you are bad. You are my nemesis. But yet he does not view himself as a bad father, a bad person. You can see where this starts to tie in, because when you're constantly being treated that way, it feels like you're constantly being swung at, right? When we've talked about how our brain processes these things, these threats to our perceived identities is the same as somebody drawing back to punch you in the face. It goes to show, like, this is why it chips at mental health so much. And then last topic we will get into before we wrap this up is just the family court system, shared parenting, and why this debate even exists, right? Because all of this, the divorced dad, is a topic that we talk about, whether or not you believe in that one hot topic or not. And one reason these conversations become so emotional is because people disagree about how families should be rebuilt after a divorce, right? Family courts often have to solve deeply emotional problems using legal tools. And if we're going to be honest, they should never have to. This is where I almost say a prenatal agreement, I don't think is that crazy of an idea of deciding what do you do now that you're bringing a child into the world if you decide to not continue with your relationship as is. Because courts can determine schedules, custody arrangements, and financial obligations, but they're also making all those decisions at the heat of the worst of some of your emotions towards each other. And they also can't repair that trust. And if you're fighting each other in the middle of this huge breach of trust that's going on, that's going to be worse. They're also not going to help heal grief or improve communication. To my point, if they're seeing the signs that communication needs to be improved, I do wish they would do something more about that. Because, yeah, they can't eliminate conflict, but my goodness, they can at least say, if we can tell a person who got busted driving drunk that we're going to give you classes because hopefully you won't drive drunk anymore. I don't understand why we can't apply the same logic. If you guys are going to come to this court and you are screaming and acting this way right now, I would like to put you in a class to make sure you don't come back to court screaming and acting like this again, right? Because there's researchers out there, and there's stuff that it seems like the courts possibly aren't as updated to know. And researchers like Richard Warshak, William Fabricus, which sounds like a crazy name, and Linda Nielsen. And they've contributed to a growing body of research suggesting that when both parents are safe and capable, children often benefit from maintaining substantial relationships with both parents. And this is why, like earlier when I was saying, like, that unfortunately should have to be the job of the court. It is the court's job to decide if the parents are safe for the kids to be around. So if a parent is in a situation where the court ultimately decided that the parent is safe for the child to be around. I guess this is where I wish people more perked an eyebrow when somebody fights and has a certain narrative about another parent. Does that make sense? Because that is kind of their job. And so therefore, if the court finds that they are safe, this research is one of many reasons the fathers' advocacy groups I mentioned support presumptions of shared parenting, also known as default 50-50 parenting arrangements. And some states have actually moved towards these. That was something fascinating I found out about Maine, because yes, we talked about it when we decided to conceive the baby Reverend. And we learned that in Maine, they had default 50-50. However, others have not. Reasonable people can disagree about implementation, but the underlying question remains important. How do we maximize children's access to loving parents while still protecting children when genuine safety concerns exist? And that may ultimately be the question at the center of this entire debate. Because yes, of course, the court system fails. There's no perfect solution. But I go back to, if people are leaving relationships in a mentally healthier space, I think we are far less likely to get to this point where it is a safety concern. Because, for example, because I was kind of involved in some of these groups for a little bit, because I did something called the Heroes Circle for a second, which was an advocacy group about parental alienation. And it was adult children of PA speaking out. That didn't end up sticking for me, but something that is kind of growing awareness of. I do not have numbers on it, but unfortunately, depending on what state you live in, there's something called the silver bullet tactic. And it's probably more controversial to talk about than parental alienation syndrome, because what it is essentially, the idea is that women can be coached into basically saying that a domestic violence happened. And in some states, it really is kind of whoever called first. And we also do have and I'm not saying this is wrong, but a little bit of the believing women thing, where there doesn't need to be a lot of proof to prove it, which is bitter but also sweet, because that does unfortunately mean, while not a large demographic, it can be used to take children away from loving fathers. Right? We have to be realistic. These things can be used for bad. And I think that's why it's more important that instead of trying to make a bunch of fail-safe rules and laws and things that you have to do, it makes more sense to concentrate on everybody's mental health. Because a mentally healthy person would see very clearly, no matter who is convincing them to make that call, that claiming somebody was highly abusive to you and they were not, so you can win in court, is not appropriate. I think a mentally healthy person who's not having their current traumatic thing they're going through being jabbed at would make those decisions easier. I think people that have therapeutic intervention to help see the value in a co-parenting relationship are far less likely to continue to only see that person as bad and therefore only have the temptation to hold contempt with them. I think focusing on mental health will fix more of our problems than rules and laws and fines and fees and things like that.
Agreed. I mean, and it's just, at the end of the day, when lawyers make a great amount of money in divorce proceedings, it's like I don't see how something like that would go away, unfortunately. And at the end of the day, 9 times out of the 10, the court is probably going to decide with the person telling the silver bullet theory about the other person. They're going to err on the side of caution, because
right, it puts them in a position. Yeah. Right? Look at the judges that, for whatever reason, they found somebody innocent of something. And then that person goes around and turns around and does something terrible because it turns out that was wrong. There is not an easy answer for this on a league. That's what I'm saying is, I don't think we can make enough laws, right, to fully protect and fully make it perfect. And that's where I think most things come down to working on the mental health of the human beings involved in these situations is going to fare better results than punishment culture. We have long learned that it doesn't work. Look at how recidivism works in other instances that our court is involved, right? Punishment obviously isn't working. A lot of times it actually makes it very impossible for the most genuine person who has seen their rock bottom in their face to turn around because of all the hoops that you didn't have to jump through, right? Because breaking probation, if you don't know this, breaking probation is as easy as not having $25. Breaking probation is as easy as not being able to make it to a spontaneous drug test that you need to go to because they called you and said that you need to be there. Like, it's not, people think breaking probation and they think they went and did the bad thing again. They just can't behave themselves. And it's a lot more complicated than that. That's recidivism is not just they did it again. Recidivism is a failure to follow probation. Right. And so we're starting to recognize that there's a lot of problems in our court system, but I've noticed people seem very hesitant to talk about the flaws in our family court system. And if we're not willing to talk about it, it's not going to get fixed. And if it's not going to get fixed, it is going to continue to affect the demographic of mental health that is growing, because it goes back to divorce isn't going anywhere, blended families isn't going anywhere. So if we're going to do these things, because, the old thing, he doesn't want his lion on his pacifier. I don't know if that'll come through at the end edit, but we've addressed it here on Friends Talking Nerdy. He does not want his lion on his pacifier. Here, I can do that while I'm talking, buddy.
He looks so exasperated right now.
He's like, as he's smiling at Tim.
Oh, yeah.
But anywho, all of that to say, it's like our court system needs to do better and we need to hold it accountable. And this is very much affecting a demographic of children who have nothing to do with it. So basically, family court, get your shit together. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. But to not completely end it on family court mumbo jumbo, let's very quickly go into rebuilding identity, a bit of a message of hope, if we will. But many divorced fathers eventually face a difficult question. Who am I now? Divorce often forces identity reconstruction, which doesn't always feel good when you're not the one wanting to do it, because many men have spent years building identities around marriage, provider roles, and the family structure. And now those structures have changed. That doesn't mean fatherhood ends. It means fatherhood evolves. Psychologist Richard Tedeschi, I think is how you say his name, and Lawrence Calhoun, they developed the concept of post-traumatic growth. And that found that some individuals eventually experience positive growth following major life disruptions. I would dare say that this might be the psychology term for rock bottom. Like when you hit rock bottom and actually turn it around, you know what I mean? But not because the disruption was good, right? But because rebuilding requires reflection. And some fathers discover stronger boundaries, deeper emotional awareness, healthier relationships, and a more intentional approach to parenting. And I think that's almost where a disservice happens to the parent who quote unquote wins, right? When you're told in a way that you lost, and in a way you don't deserve more than this amount of time with your kids, some would expect maybe that person might reflect on why that is. Now, whether if it was rightfully so or not, that doesn't mean good self-reflection can't come from it. A situation still happened to you that shook you to your core. And it's very much, how do you deal with that as a person? And so if you can tap into what we've mentioned a few times of the growth mentality, I think you can turn around who you ultimately end up being. Because sometimes being a great dad after divorce isn't about holding the family together. Sometimes it's about showing your children that love can remain consistent even when life changes completely. And you got to find that love language that works for your kids. For the Mr. Reverend, it's being bus buddy to his oldest whenever they're waiting on the bus. And dropping in whenever they're like, oh my God, I need to study for something. Like, he will make it happen. He doesn't care if they fought the night before. He will make those things happen. With his son, it is playing video games and talking. And when he's here, going on bike rides. You know what I mean? He has invested in finding those things. Now, that's something that's traditionally new and nice, right? That's almost a good thing that came from fathers having a more emotional role being expected, is that you're more in tune to try to find those things to stay connected. So it's just basically helping them stay on board too. But basically, relationships, they're going to look different as life transitions. But there we go. That's what I was getting at, was the thing that, if I could put a message out there to whoever you are, you awesome people who have your children majority of the time, I do think it's arguably one of the best things you can do is find a way in yourself to at least encourage the relationship as you would have had you stayed together and that parent was just in the other room instead.
100% agreed on that.
Yeah.
And
Their
I
other
mean,
room is just in another house, right? But that
yeah,
relationship is just as important to encourage repair with as when, you know what I mean? Is it when they're in the next room? That's all, like a little bit of that is like, if you were still living together, you would encourage that more. And so just know, like, your children need you for that. They
yeah,
need your help with that because it is going to be confusing for them with the physical time not being there anymore, especially if they're younger. So, really, that's one of the nice things you can do for your kids. You can still really not like them. You can choose to never really want to talk to them again. You can be completely parallel in every other respect, right? But when it comes to your kids with their relationship, the best thing you can do is be that parent that they don't feel like they have to hide their joy from you, and be that parent who knows ultimately that relationship is important, and give the guidance to help repair a relationship just as if they'd had a falling out with one of their best friends that you know for a fact that the whatever the fight was about probably needs to be fixed, right? Like, there's these things that you can do. And I think if we can really tap into that mentality instead of over, well, the court said that I won, I think that's going to do really, really well. Yes, for the mental health of your ex that you probably don't care about, because that's really what today's episode is. But the end result, the third order effect of it, is that your children's mental health will be positively affected by this too. I mean, likely should be, especially when you compare it to factually being negatively impacted when the relationship is bad with the other parent, right?
yeah. If anything, focus on the kids. If your focus is truly on the kids and not quote unquote winning, then I think everybody wins at that particular point.
Right. And
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my sorry not sorry is the dude that it didn't work out with doesn't deserve to feel like a loser when it comes to being a father. Like, I don't think so. Maybe he could feel like like, because hey, tale as old as time. I've heard it. Many of my friends have even said, like, well, he's a great dad, but he was just a terrible partner for me. And that's valid, but you should try to tap into, but they're a great dad, or but they're a great mom, right? Like, with that X mentality, like, stop focusing so much on them being bad for you. And maybe if you can focus more into how they're good for your kid, you can trick yourself into being more positive on that relationship, which then is going to honestly transfer to your kids, because we go back to their little absorbers, man. They are sponges because that's what they're built to do.
Yeah, and I think I'll definitely bookend by, stating the obvious here, and we've said it before in this episode and in other episodes before when we've talked about similar stuff. If we're talking about abuse and whatnot, split, and that is fine there, and especially if we're talking about if one of the parents abuses a child or something like that, split. We're not trying to advocate that people like that should get unfettered
Right.
attention with that kid. We're talking about just regular splits here. And
Exactly, because
yeah,
that also should ideally be one of the situations where the court decides that home isn't safe, right? Ideally. Now, I know that doesn't always happen, and I'm sorry that it's not a perfect system, but I don't think punishing good dads is necessarily the right answer either. It's like, right, like, there's some people, it's like one innocent person being put on death row like isn't worth having death row. There's some people that have that mentality. I know that's one that I personally hold, because I think there's better ways to deal with it than accidentally killing people who maybe didn't do it. But that being said, it's an imperfect world. And the only way we're going to get to real solutions is having the hard conversations and talking about the realities from different perspectives. Because when you get sold that it is as easy as this solution, that is somebody or something that is probably trying to take advantage of a simplicity bias. Because if the solution sounds simple, oh, we want it to be simple, but that's actually where I think you need to really put on those skepticals and look at it a little bit harder and make sure, is this really simple, or is this tickling my simplicity bias? And is somebody potentially getting something out of making me believe it's this simple?
Yeah, because the only simple solution here is like, if you don't have kids, wear a condom and don't get married ever.
The real solution is arrest everybody, because then nobody can murder, right? Like,
Exactly.
We'll just give hyperbolic blanket solutions here at Friends Talking Nerdy.
Yeah, totally reasonable, folks. Totally reasonable.
Well, I guess we should wrap up because, the baby Reverend wants breakfast number 3, by the way. For anybody who thinks I'm starving my child, he had me make overnight oats last night, which is his new favorite thing. And then he had a breakfast burrito, and now he wants something else. And it's not even 9 o'clock in the morning yet.
You're raising a hobbit.
I know. Let's see. Are those fleet fat? Nope. The feet are not fat. The fleet flat.
Or furry, yeah.
Or furry. They're not furry or flat yet. So I guess I don't have a hobbit. I just have a hungry boy.
Well, there you go. Thank you for that wonderful leading us. I know you are always, you started off being self-deprecating once again, but I love it when you lead.
I can't help it. Like, just my love language to myself is self-deprecation, guys. It's how I roll. I promise I'm not. Oh, okay, nope, I'm not going to lie to you guys. I am actually pretty hard on myself most of the time. But, I know I say right too much when I'm listening to it. So if that annoys anybody else, you just feel free to leave a comment because, we'll take a dip for the algorithm for Tim to decide whether or not he wants to share it with me.
Well, yeah, and yeah, as I've warned before, don't do drinking games based on me saying you will die.
Yeah, if you guys want alcohol poisoning, every time I say right, and every time Tim the Nerd says we will help you get intoxicated. # go back and listen to our episode on the history of drinking holidays.
Yeah, Well, next week we are going to be wrapping up Fatherhood Month, and I think your closing of what you did today is kind of a nice little introduction of what we will be talking about, because we will be talking about fatherhood and identity loss.
Nice. Yep. So stay tuned for that, folks. That is going to be me and Tim, right? That's us two this time. I know we have our other host that we alternate between, but I couldn't remember if she was taking that one or me.
No,
okay, cool. It'll be us too. So that'll be us next time as well. And then I already know the TLDL lined up for this one is going to be going into some of Mr. Lamb's theories, talking a little bit more on that attachment with fathers and why it matters. So, and what we can do to kind of help repair it, either if we felt a fissure in our own relationship with our fathers, or say you are that parent that went, oh no, I accidentally did the things. Because it goes back to, and I said it a lot, probably could turn into a drinking game with the last episode. It's just important to get off the train once you realize you're on the wrong train. If you realize you've been that parent who maybe you haven't done as well at supporting the relationship your children have with the other parent outside of your home, and you are seeing signs of issues between said child and parent, just think on it. If you feel like, if you go, oh crap, I've done the shadow work on this now, and I can totally see where, yeah, I hate that person, and that's probably bleeding over in this way, and maybe I shouldn't have made that comment. I feel so bad. I bet there are ways that we can undo that. So I am going to try to give some suggestions, just like I did with the alexithymia episode that just posted.
Exactly. And then on Friday, we will have another Songs of the Week.
Yeah, so stay tuned. We are working on getting our consistent content rolled out for all of you guys.
Well, all right. Any other words for our friends at home before we wrap things up and get the baby Reverend breakfast number 3? Breakfast
number 3 is ready to go, probably very, very soon. At least he probably just wants a fig bar or something, so at least it's fast. But I should try to make him eat food.
Well, for the baby Reverend's stomach, each week we will have something in this podcast space to entertain your ear holes. Until we meet again, we bid you adieu.
Later, taters.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.